First of all, I want to thank the Tokyo Jolt
Welcome.
chapter for inviting me. It is an honor and a privilege to
Oh,
present this. Um, the presentation will kind of go over these phases. I will set the context. I'll go over what the project was in terms of a timeline. I'll talk a bit about the research process. I'll then talk about some of the research outputs that we had. I'll then get to some reflection points and to a Q&A.
mm,
Because there isn't too many people here, if anything is unclear, feel free to raise your hand or to send Heather a message and we can stop the flow of the presentation and talk. Um, the presentation will be presented in kind of a in-between place where I'm not going to present this as a bona fide research paper, but I'm also not going to present it as a teacher-centric presentation. So I won't get too technical, but there'll be some technicalities in terms of what I talk about. What I'm going to talk about tonight was developed, or I should say, like driven by three things. The first is a KAKENHI grant that I was awarded in 2021. The second is a paper that I published with colleagues based in Japan that presented the first validity evidence for a survey that we made for self-efficacy. And then finally, there was the paper in language learning where we looked at, and this is related to the title of this talk, how three individual difference factors, willingness to communicate, speaking self-efficacy, and perceived communicative competence, predicted second language spoken task production within the Japanese university context. So I'm basically going to be telling the story of how this research came to be, what we learned from this research, and what we as Japan-based practitioner researchers can take away from it. So that's essentially what I will be talking about tonight. If that's clear to everyone, please show me thumbs up.
mhm.
Everyone's good? All right. So I will ask a rhetorical question, which is why focus on speaking? There are four language skills. Why is speaking worthy of our focus? And I think in Japan, there are several reasons for that. And I think worldwide, there are several reasons for that. If we think about human experience, speaking and listening were the first language skills. So we as a species could speak and listen before we could read and write. If we fast forward to the modern age, and this is from Koizumi et al., this was published in Language Testing in Asia, they aggregated several databases of Japanese university learners, and they found a consistent trend. And you're looking at this column here. I don't know why my highlighter didn't work, but that's okay. What they found consistently is that speaking and writing, but especially speaking, is the worst relative skill among Japanese learners. And we
Mm,
know as we know as teachers this tends to be true. And I wanted to kind of tell two stories to kind of frame the uniqueness that speaking has, I think, as teachers, but also as learners and just as humans. So I will begin quickly. This picture on the right is of my father when he was a very young boy, and my great-grandfather, like most Americans. Um, I have ancestry that's not America-based, if you will, and my father's side comes from Naples and from Sicily. And the story about my great-grandfather was that he only would speak English when he was working. At home, he refused to speak English. And one of the ways that my father ingratiated him with himself, with my great-grandfather, was that he learned to speak Italian for his approval, for his praise. And I tell that story not to be kind of, not to really take the discussion too far off course, but I think it kind of highlights how the language that we speak is a strong part of our identity. And one of the things that you will always hear is that there are cultural barriers to developing Japanese speaking ability in English to the same level that they can read and write, and sometimes listen, especially academically. This picture here, $40,000 for a speaking test, relates to a story that occurred at my last place of employment before I went to Waseda. So the university that I worked at before, you can look up the name, I don't really feel like saying it now, was unique in that our TOEFL score, their TOEFL scores were very, very high. And they had relationships with universities from around the world. And when students came from Arizona or when they came from Europe and tried to speak English to our students or to the students at the university where I was working, they could not speak. And the executives were very perplexed because they said, if we look at our TOEFL paper scores, our guys are solidly B1, some are B2, why can't they speak? And one of the things that they did, and this is where the $40,000 comes into play, they gave my department a special internal grant to buy speaking tests to demo and to develop new teaching approaches to get it so that their speaking ability would be more congruent with their listening ability. And I think that story can kind of personalize the idea that speaking in English is something that is somewhat important in this context and somewhat valued in this context. Of course, we try to teach all skills, but speaking has a special place here, I think. Everyone's okay with that? Everyone is following along? Can I continue? Okay. So one of the things, and this is where I probably should show my slide, I should do a presentation. One of the things that is interesting about the skill of speaking as well is that AI still isn't quite ready to handle live speaking. So ASR, which is automated speech recognition technology, is improving, but it's not accurate enough to handle things like a live discussion or a live debate. I think this stands in stark contrast to reading and writing, where AI can write essays, they can translate text. So I think speaking in the age of AI only gains importance in terms of a skill that we need to focus on. I knew this was going to happen. Excuse me.
Oh, did I do that? Did I do that?
No, it's just that as soon as I excuse me.
Open
it's fine.
okay.
Yes, as soon as I go full screen, it kind of freezes. Okay. So this project is kind of set in the context of how does psychology and language learning intersect with task-based speaking. And there were some kind of ideas that formulated as we came up with the project, which I'll talk about in a moment. But there are three certain individual differences, or sometimes called motivational individual differences, that have a clear connection with how our students engage with and produce in spoken tasks. These are willingness to communicate, as the name implies, it's just the student's willingness to talk, speak. Task focused spoken self-efficacy, and task focus means that you would measure self-efficacy differently for a three-person discussion task versus a two-person debate. And perceived communicative competence, which is more of a global measure of how they view their speaking competence. The point of this research, or the point of this question, is that if we can understand how these individual differences influence spoken task performance, we can use this knowledge to encourage and develop engagement with speaking as teachers and program managers. So what we were interested in was to understand the complexities of how these three constructs predicted how students engaged with a speaking task. Because if we understood this relationship, we could then make recommendations for teaching, make recommendations for program management, and for curriculum design. And that is that kind of wraps up the theoretical context of what we were trying to do. Is everyone okay with that? Anyone have any questions? Okay, so moving on, if we think about the context in terms of situating the research in the existing research methods arena of what's been published, there are several issues that we wanted to be mindful of, that we wanted to correct for as we went forward. And I will discuss each of these in some detail. So the first one is the questionnaire curse. And what the questionnaire curse is the notion that all the variables in a psychology and language learning study come from surveys, come from questionnaires. And just to get some feedback, because I've been speaking for about almost 15 minutes now, in the chat, if you would like, why is the questionnaire curse bad? Why would the questionnaire curse be something that we would want to avoid? Feel free to type your opinion.
So these questionnaires are things you would ask the students about their,
It would be basically like, think about a Likert scale where they would give their opinion, they would give their response about how they viewed their speaking ability. But imagine if the entire study, the independent variables and the dependent variable, was all questionnaire measured. What's the problem with that type of design?
That's a good question.
It may not reflect the participants' real feelings or thoughts. Good. Okay. Okay, good. Adam, nice. Okay.
We need to be certain that we are only measuring one construct. Yeah.
Right. The real good. And Nicholas brings up a good point, which is that if we're researching TBLT, if we're measuring task-based performance, ultimately, we need to have something that comes from the task. And this was the main point that we wanted to address with this project. That for self-efficacy, and everyone, thank you for your thoughts, for willingness to communicate and for perceived communicative competence, we are forced to use Likert measures. And that we can't bring in 100 fMRI machines or brain scanning machines. And even if we could, we don't know how to measure that currently within the brain. But on the outcome side, on the language performance side, we can have discrete boots on the ground TBLT measures that can add to the validity, to the trustworthiness of our research. And that can make our research more appropriate and more influential for teaching and for program management. Everyone is with me so far? Okay. Then I will share my screen again. Thank you for your patience. So the next 2 points are related, which is that there's currently a lack of TBLT outcome measures. So getting back, and thank you for typing your answers. I always like to have a interactive presentation. Imagine a study that was TBLT set, but they used a test. Think of a speaking test, or think of a reading test if the task was related to reading. What would the problem of using a language test be if we're interested in researching TBLT? Feel free to type your answers. So if we say like, okay, we're not going to use surveys, but we're going to use tests, whether the TOEFL, the TOEIC, things like that, or even classroom tests, what would the problem be if in a TBLT context, if we wanted to do quantitative research?
On a speaking task?
Yes.
I think it's the amount of like resources and time. It'd be very time consuming, maybe.
Sure. Okay. Good. Eric Martin has so it's notoriously hard to assess, which it is. Good. Good. Nicholas, I like your ideas. Good. Adam, good. Okay, I'll give another minute. Okay, it seems like everyone has given their good. Chris, very good. Okay, so everyone, thank you for your input. And I want to begin with Chris's answer, which is that a standardized test measures general ability, not performance on a specific task. Now, TBLT is notoriously difficult to define. There are lots of different, there's lots of different researchers and theorists who will argue over how to define it. But if we were to say that there's one common thread to these definitions, is that it has to in some way replicate or resemble how we're using language in the real world. And the concept of a weak task was developed just because sometimes in the classroom we have to stretch real world resemblance, but a TOEFL by no stretch of the imagination is a task. Everyone is with me so far? And again, thank you to everyone. Nicholas Marks said something interesting, which is that how do we measure the depth of the outcome? And that's something to think about with the research, which I'm going to present, that we measured we had a task-based outcome variable, but if we're being self-critical, it could have been deeper. And that's one of the challenges to this type of research. So I'm glad that we're all thinking about this the same way. Let me go back to the PowerPoint. So the project had several steps, and I'll talk through each one. In 2020, I was invited to join a paper where it was single site, and it was addressing a similar research question, and we prepared the paper. And it was single site, and there was only about 80 people. And as we began to submit the paper to decent journals, it became clear that we had a good idea, but we didn't have the sample size or the sampling. I won't get into it too much, but in quantitative research, if you have single site, if all your participants come from one school, it has a disadvantage vis-a-vis multi-site samples. So we decided then in 2021 that we needed money to do this research the right way. So I applied for a KAKENHI startup grant. I was fortunate enough to get the grant. And then in late 2021, because with the startup KAKENHI, you are rushed a bit, that you apply in May of the academic year, you get accepted in September, and then you basically have 3 semesters to use your funding. So from late 2021 to through 2022, we collected data, we had to curate the data, analyze it, and then in 2023 and 2024, we then published 2 papers. One, which was on the validation of a new self-efficacy scale, because self-efficacy needs to be task-focused. That's one of the deficiencies in existing research. And then one was the bigger paper, which was the hypothesis testing, where we were able to see how the 3 individual difference variables interacted with task output. So the research process followed these steps. It was quite intensive. It took a lot of time. And it was interesting, and that's part of the presentation that we're going to transition to. This research wouldn't have been possible if I had been by myself. It required a team. And I think that's something that we can take away from this talk, hopefully, the benefits of collaborative research and how it kind of gives us access to findings and to research products which may be better or have the potential to be better than single author projects. So the first output was a validation of the self-efficacy scale for the task that we used. And the task that we used was a 3-person discussion task. For those of you who have experience at Ricchio's EDC or Waseda, it's quite similar to what was done. What we did in this paper was that we built the survey from the ground up, where we workshopped the different skills or the different competencies that would be needed to be successful in the task. We created a pilot sample to test the survey's psychometric suitability. It was found that it was reliable, that it was valid. And we were able to publish this as an example for frontline researchers in RELC Journal, which was quite surprising, and I would say pleasantly surprising to us, simply because validation papers sometimes have difficulty getting published. And that's something I would like to talk about, hopefully for your benefit, that it took us some time to find a journal that was willing to publish this. We were surprised that the reviewers were as positive about our work, because validation work isn't catchy. It's really not going to get cited that much. And from the journal's point of view, that is a problem. But it was interesting that they could see our argument that validation is a long game, that just because you have a suitable observation with one sample, it doesn't mean that you can say that the instrument is validated, that you have to repeatedly show that the instruments that you are using are reliable, are valid. And I think the takeaway from this story, or from this mini story, I should say, for attendees or for those of us who are researching in the Japanese context, don't be afraid to write up pieces of your research that you think can be a positive demonstration or a positive example for the applied linguistic community. We were very, very surprised and shocked and happy that when we started to cite education guidance saying that you can't validate all at once and you need a repeated measure of that, or repeated measure is the wrong word, it means something else, but you need to show that the instrument can repeatedly work. It was interesting that a journal of RELC's impact factor was interested in publishing that. And I share that just to say, as you guys do your research, as you have things that you think may not be that consequential, if it demonstrates a good process, if it demonstrates rigor, I think you'd be surprised who would be interested in publishing that. So everyone's okay with that? Any questions? Then I'm going to continue. Okay, so the next step of the research process was to address our main question. And this question was quite simple. It was, to what extent do willingness to communicate, perceived communicative competence, and task-specific spoken self-efficacy predict spoken task production among relatively advanced university EFL learners in Japan? I'm going to ask a question because I need a break from talking. Why do you think the research question, and please type, why do you think the research question has been written to be very specific in terms of what type of EFL learners we are trying to investigate? Like, why do you think we were granular in setting our intended population about whom to make inferences? Please type your answer. Sure. So in the PowerPoint, why do you think we said among relatively advanced university learners? Why didn't we just say this? So we could have asked the question this way, but we asked the question, pardon me. But we asked the question this way. Why do you think we decided to be specific about isolating the type of Japanese learner that we wanted to make inferences about, that we wanted to research on? Good, very good answers. And I'll give another minute. Okay, good. And I really like the answers that we have. So Adam is absolutely right that because we did the research with students from highly ranked universities whose proficiency profile was different than the norm in Japan, our inferences and our validation work wasn't going to necessarily generalize to them, and we can make claims about that. As Chris said, that we are acknowledging that it's not going to generalize everywhere, and I think Nicholas makes a very good point that as you read about psychology and language learning, proficiency is a very impactful covariate. And what that is to say that low proficiency learners will have different trends and patterns than those who are of a higher proficiency. So this kind of, I kind of highlight this to show the importance when you do this type of research to consider the population that you seek to make inferences about. Now, if we think about, just before I get into the results, what were some stories about the process? We were surprised that it got published. We were happily surprised. But we did think we had a chance because through the grapevine, we heard that they were actively rejecting survey-driven research, that they were really interested in language and discrete boots on the ground language learning outcomes. The thing that we were really surprised by was that even though it took several rounds of revisions, the interaction with the reviewers was somewhat positive. And I tell this story again to highlight that if you have a study that has very good methods, that is rigorous, you should submit it to the best journal possible. But I also think it's interesting that sometimes as Japan-based researchers, at least I felt this way when I was beginning, I might have been intimidated by some of the international journals. But again, if you have a good idea, if you've done it rigorously, they can be really nice and really friendly and open to helping you publish and to improving the paper. So I think that is an important takeaway. Again, the methods that we used, we had a multi-site sample, we were powered, we had cross-validation, which means that we tested the structure of the 3 individual variances on a sample of 209 people, but then again on 230 that we used to answer our research question, which we talk about here. We shared all of the data, we shared all of the code. We had a few main findings. The first was that we had suitable psychometrics observed. So the 3 variables were measured accurately, to put it in layman's terms. Again, because we took the trouble to have 2 samples, it was something that they appreciated and something that they commented on. In terms of the question, we found something interesting. So we had our first model, and SEM is, I don't want to get too technical, but for those of you who understand what regression is a type of SEM. SEM is a broader type of testing approach that lets you be a bit more flexible and a bit more, it gives you more freedom in terms of what you test. So
SIM is it's short for, it's an acronym for standard
structural, it's a short for structural equation modeling. And what we found with the first SEM was that perceived communicative competence was not significant, that willingness to communicate and speaking self-efficacy were significant, and the values of 0.24 and 0.28 basically tell us that it was a moderate effect to a weak effect, which we would expect because we are measuring these with survey items. But what was interesting with this model is that we had evidence that students' views of their ability relative to the task had more predictiveness compared to their overall speaking ability. And that has implications as teachers, because I think it tells us that we need to be aware and we need to focus on making students aware of how we're developing their language ability and especially their speaking ability in relation to the specific actions, activities, and tasks that we're asking them to do, more so than highlighting their awareness of how their speaking ability is in a general sense. Now, of course, that's important, but the model is telling us in terms of predicting active in terms of predicting spoken task production, which was measured in terms of output, the number of words that they spoke. And we controlled by using lexical diversity and density measures to show that it could be a valid measure of behavioral task output. That in terms of this type of question, maybe views of their ability specific to the task were more important. But the beauty of SEM is that SEM lets you say, well, okay, this is one model, but let's try another model. Let's see if there is a antecedent effect going on, where the views of one's ability antecedes or predicts one's willingness to communicate. And then that has a direct relationship with spoken task engagement, with behavioral engagement in spoken tasks. And we using fit statistics, specifically AIC, this number is lower than this number. So we can say that this model fits better. Basically, it is a more trustworthy model using the data that we have. And what becomes interesting about this is now I think we get a clear picture of how this research could inform and perhaps improve the the teaching of speaking within the Japanese university context, which is to say that if we want students to engage in speaking tasks, it's important for them to have an awareness, to have a clear understanding of their abilities vis-a-vis the task, also vis-a-vis their general proficiency. And as they gain confidence, or as they grow in their view of their ability, they will in turn be more willing to communicate or to behaviorally engage in speaking tasks. And that's how that's kind of the grand finale, if you will, of this research, that we were able to come up with two models. And we argued that the model on the right side was more appropriate in terms of predicting how much students would engage in these tasks and how individual differences can work to predict how they engage in these tasks, and perhaps how we can model our teaching and our lessons and kind of our guidance to students to help them engage more in speaking tasks. So again, I think I've spoken enough, and the summary I've already said. But I am curious. So the technical term, this model here, which we said was worse, is the unmediated model. This is just a regression model. This is a mediated model. So which model, and let's call this one model 1, or let's call this model 1. This is model 2. Which model makes more sense to you, and why? So in terms of reflecting how you see your students engaging in speaking, model 1, which says that perceptions of their speaking ability inform or predict their willingness to communicate, which in turn predicts the actual amount of their engagement in these tasks. Remembering Nicholas's point that our measure wasn't very deep, I will admit that, or that all three measures work together side by side to predict spoken task engagement. So which one do you think is more sensible to you? Which one do you think is more valid to your experience? Model 1 or model 2, and why?
We do have a question about how you determined advanced.
Sure. I'll just answer it. So In Japan, I need to set the context, and everyone please answer. So in Japan, university rules are quite strict about student data. And it's especially sensitive to test performance. So at University 1, they had TOEFL scores. University 2, they had TOEIC scores. Using ETS conversion tables, we could demonstrate that most students were B1 and some were B2 and some were A2, but we couldn't publish that.
Mm.
So, so relatively advanced would be that if we look at Cepher J data, a
Mm.
sample that's mostly B1 is relatively advanced against the country kind of distribution.
Mm.
That's what that means. And we substantiated this claim via ETS data that we could not share.
Mm.
Does that make sense?
Yeah, that makes sense. I have another question. So
Sure.
these models, you've only used advanced students for. So do you think there might be a discrepancy between like lower proficiency
Yes.
students? So the
Yes.
model might be different. So these
The model will be different probably. So that's one of the
oh
things that becomes interesting
yeah.
because with quantitative research, you have to define what your population is,
Mm.
right? So for example, some medication has different guidance based on the ethnicity of the patient, right? And if we think about that in terms of an inferential testing point of view, what we're saying is that the population isn't homogeneous, that there's two distinct
Mm.
populations. And I don't want to get into which medicines because I'm not a doctor, but just take my word for it, right? So just as we know that medicine X works on this ethnicity um, different than another group, we only had access to relatively advanced students.
Mm.
So our inferences, our claims had to be constrained to them.
Mm.
Right now, if we wanted to get more money, if we wanted to recruit more students from different proficiency bands, we could then ask the question and do the research again, seeking to make inferences further afield. But
Mm.
because of the constraints that we had, we said this is the population about whom we are making inferences.
So when you go to like you wanted to do like let's see, develop and engage students with speaking, really those sort of recommendations would be for advanced students, or would they?
Right. Yeah, and it would be for advancements, but again, we would think that maybe this would transfer. And in fact, I would say it probably would, but as quantitative researchers,
Mm.
we have to err on the side of caution, right? And I think if the field has a problem, it's not cautious enough, and that's what we were trying to do.
Mm. Yeah.
Um, good. So perceived communicative competence is just we measured it via survey items. It grows
Mm.
out of the Japanese research context. It was developed in the zeros. So all three measures were operationalized. Perceived communicative competence, willingness to communicate, speaking self-efficacy, were all operationalized via survey items. The outcome variable was operationalized via recordings of students' output, and it was simply a word count. Does that answer your question? Okay. Okay, good. I will continue. So yeah, I really liked Eric's input that the revised model makes a bit more sense. And I think this is the beauty of SEM. It gives us a bit more flexibility in terms of what we want to test. So I would like to end now with a few reflections and then give you guys a chance to ask questions. The first point is that this research project would have been impossible without teamwork. And I was fortunate enough to have five people join me in this, and they did different things. And it was interesting too, because it was a very like spread out, unique range of contributions. So for example, Dylan Hicks 10 years ago did the transcription on the original project that got rejected from several papers. But in that work, he was able to help us with the data curation and with the validation of kind of the transcription work. And he's a wonderful teacher, but again, he's kind of a practitioner researcher. Phil Hyber, who is a contact from Florida State, is he's pretty well known in the psychology circles. And we wouldn't have been able to do all the SEM work without him, and especially navigate language learning's institutional culture. Paul Leeming and I kind of worked together as kind of the leads of the project. And he was very useful in terms of getting the theory right and getting the framing right. And good quantitative research always does that, where you set the theory and the question first before you do the research. Stuart McLean, who I work with in vocabulary work, interestingly enough, about 10 years ago, he came up with this idea, shared it with us, and he kind of helped us with the novelty of it and kind of helped us with the uniqueness of it. And Chris Nicklin helped us with the visualization work, but also when it came to refining the task, preparing the task, and also because of his expertise with the stats work. So the reflection point here is that I think I wouldn't have been able to do this project without the team. And I think if we think about research, of course, there are career implications, and it's for our own benefit in some ways. But if we think about research in terms of producing good work that has implications for the field and that can help the field, I think teamwork and collaboration are key. The second point is that, when it comes to this type of research, sometimes the questions are too broad, and sometimes they are unfocused. And I think this research and the clarity of its findings and the clarity of its implications shows that we need to be granular, that we need to be focused. And then finally, one of the things that I think is interesting when I reflected on this, because this presentation will basically end this project. Sometimes it's better to do research that takes a long time. Sometimes we don't need to be fast. Sometimes it's good to be robust. And just reflecting on what these papers have done for me and for my colleagues, I think it was worth it. And just thinking about returning to the story I told about my ex-employer, when I was doing the work to help them improve their speaking proficiency, there was a tangential benefit provided by this research. So again, I think sometimes as researchers, I know I was the same when I first began, there's that pressure to be quick and to get papers out as soon as possible. But sometimes it is useful to kind of take a step back, take on projects that are going to take more time, because in the end, the resulting products are going to be better and more useful. So that's it. Thank you. I will happily answer your questions now.